Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Avi Havivi's weekly Siddur class.
We're continuing with Rabbi Greenberg, Irving Greenberg. This is part 2. I think we'll finish this week, although I don't know, it may morph into a third week. And I hope you listened to last week because otherwise we're jumping in the middle. Rabbi Greenberg, modern Orthodox theologian of the last few decades of the 20th century, first couple of decades of this century, who wrote his magnum opus, published it about 2 years ago, called The Triumph of Life, which we're talking about, which is his whole theology of the 3 eras of Judaism. And we talked about 2 eras last time, and we're getting up to modernity, the 3rd era. I'm going to review very briefly. I'm not going to reread all the text. It's all available, and you can listen to the podcast or the whatever it is, the recording from last time. So in brief, our Rabbi Yitz says, biblical era was the first era of Judaism in which God is very involved with the Jewish people, like a parent who is very involved with their children and has to do everything for them. And God gives instructions, intervenes in history, makes miracles, rewards and punishes, and is very active. Stage 2 is the rabbinic era, in which God starts to pull back, and God's role in the world, and this, Rabbi Greenberg says this is an act of tzimtzum, of self-limitation. If you remember that concept from Kabbalah, God chooses to limit God's self or step back, analogous to as a parent does maybe with a teenager, and is now engaged in more even partnership. And in the more even partnership, this is manifest through rabbinic interpretation of Torah. So humans now have the ability and the right to interpret what God's will is. And this is exemplified most sharply in the famous story of the debate between Rabbi Eliezer and the rabbis, where Rabbi Eliezer says it's forbidden about this particular oven, and he calls forth miracles, and the miracles support his point of view, and then he actually says, let a voice come out of heaven, and they say, we don't care about miracles. He says, let a voice come out of heaven. A voice comes out of heaven saying, listen to Rabbi Eliezer, he's correct. And Rabbi Yoshua famously says, we don't listen to voices that come from heaven. We have decided, majority rules. Rabbi Eliezer loses this argument. So this is the story that rabbis always cite as exemplifying the attitude that the Torah is given to humans to interpret, and that's how we know what we're supposed to do. And although its origin is divine, it's no longer God directly telling us what to do. It's us interpreting God's will. Take a step back. Rabbi Greenberg says the fundamental relationship of God with human beings is covenant, and a covenant, or, two-sided agreement, and that covenant gradually expands to include more people. So in stage 1, biblical Judaism, it's only the Jews. In stage 2, this covenant expands to include more people having their interpretation of God, of what God's will is. And Rabbi Greenberg includes Christianity in this, and he sees Christianity as a great, massive expansion of God's covenant to the world. Again, I'm not familiar with any of his writings mentioning Islam, but I would assume that he would say this also about Islam. And as I said last week, he was very involved in Jewish-Christian dialogue in the 60s and onwards. So this is a very important part of his thinking. And now we're up to stage 3, which is modernity, and then we'll link it back to the Siddur. Everyone with me? Any questions about stage 1 or stage 2? And if you didn't listen to it or read the text from last week, please go back and listen to it. Or, if you're interested, you can go back and listen. It's there on the website. Any questions about stage 1 and stage 2? So stage 3 is modernity, and modernity isn't the 20th century for him. Modernity is the dawning of kind of emancipation and the scientific age, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century. And he says that in the 3rd age, the human interpretation of covenant, I'll take one more step back. What is the purpose of this covenant? Like, what does God want from the world? He has several chapters on that, but basically God is ultimate life, freedom, creativity, two other things that I can't remember. Life, freedom, creativity, and two other things. And God wants human beings to expand life, freedom, creativity, equality is the fourth thing, and I can't remember the fifth thing. So what is the covenant about? Hashem wants humanity to fulfill its destiny. Humanity fulfill its destiny by expanding in the human sphere life, freedom, goodness, equality, and creativity. Now I got all five things. I'm going to say them again. Life, goodness, freedom, equality, and creativity. That's the purpose of the covenant. In stage 3, God does another act of tzimtzum and pulling back and does not intervene at all. It's like God is like the parent of the adult who says, I've given you my teachings, forsake ye not my Torah. This is your life. So in this era, God does not intervene at all. God does not make miracles, okay? God does not give people cancer. God does not cure people of cancer. This is going to be important when we get to, so why do we pray? Okay? And Rabbi Greenberg says, as a further expansion of the covenant, whereas stage 2, the covenant, which was originally just with Bnei Israel, expanded through other monotheistic faiths. In stage 3, says Yitz, the covenant expands even further, even to people who are not explicitly religious, but who are doing God's will by helping human beings get to greater life, freedom, goodness, equality, was the fifth thing, and creativity. So he says, for example, so he's very big on science, right? So he says scientists, people who are working to cure cancer, people who are human rights workers, right? People who are working to expand the realms of freedom, dignity, life, equality, et cetera, et cetera. These people are all fulfilling God's covenant. They may not realize that because they may not use God language, okay? But they are fulfilling God's covenant, and they are almost sort of like the Kohanim of our era. By the way, very often thinkers are influenced by things in their life. It's not just philosophy in their head. Things happen in their life which can influence their thinking. So I did say to you that Rabbi Greenberg, his theology starts out with a response to his studies about the Shoah in the early 60s, that he couldn't believe that, in a traditional theology where God goes poof, but then God decided to not go poof to save 6 million people, including 1.5 million children. He can't wrap his head around that. And that's how he comes with it. That's a big part of how he comes around to this theology. His theology of God has elected to step back from history and not intervene. He was very involved in interreligious dialogue with Christianity after Vatican II in the 60s. And this probably, no doubt, is a part of how he comes around to the idea of God's covenant, originally with Bnei Israel only, expands through Christianity. And a third important factor is he had a child who died. I don't know the details. I think as a young adult, and I think of cancer. I'm not exactly sure.
No, Avi.
Thank you. Please correct me. Go.
Yes.
Briefly.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
okay.
I'm just asking you to speak briefly.
Okay, briefly. I think he was in a bicycle accident that way.
Thank you. Thank you for correcting me. I appreciate that. So he talks. That had a big impact on him, having a child die, and he talks about that explicitly in his theology at times in his book, The Triumph of Life. And he says doctors are part of the people who are fulfilling God's covenant because they are expanding the realm of life. Expanding the realm of life means helping people live longer, live healthier, cure disease. Okay, so science is working on feeding more people, and feeding more people comes down to feeding the hungry, which is in Isaiah. So he says all of these things. Very many human rights workers, scientists, people working on technology, people who are working to support and expand the realm of human creativity, freedom, equality, life, and the fifth thing that I can't remember. All of these people are enacting, fulfilling, however you want to phrase it, God's covenant, even though they may be intellectually and theoretically unaware of that. You might ask a scientist, why do you do what you do? Why are you trying to cure disease? They might just say, I find it interesting and it's a good job. Okay. They may not say, because I'm trying to make the world a better place. Although I'm guessing many of them would say, because I'm trying to make the world a better place. Okay. So in the third era, God has stepped back entirely, left it up to us. And however, human endeavor, let's just call it the modern scientific era for shorthand, okay, even though it includes human rights activists, but let's just call it the modern scientific era. He says still the modern scientific era needs to be guided by God consciousness of the purpose of the covenant. If it is not guided by God consciousness, then sometimes you get human endeavors that claim that they are expanding the realm of human goodness and achievement, except they might actually be Stalinism or Nazism, right? So he's a 20th century thinker, even though he published his book 2 years ago in his early 90s, right? So he says progress, a sense of progress not guided by moral consciousness as given to us by God can sometimes go awry. God still chooses not to intervene. That's why we have the Shoah. That's how he answers theologically his Shoah question. Because God says, I don't do that Red Sea stuff anymore. It's not my role. We talked last week about theism and deism, in the 1700s. So you could say God goes from being a theos to being a dios, right? God chooses through tzimtzum, stepping back to say to the human race, as it were, this is your life. I have given it to you. I have given you good teachings, forsake ye not my Torah. This is your job to figure it out now. Pause for a moment. I want to gather my thoughts. We're gonna read a few texts about this in a moment. But if you remember, I had started out when we started modernity talking about Mordechai Kaplan, saying in some sense, I think all modern thinkers have to respond to Kaplan. Kaplan said, we live in the scientific era. We know that pneumonia doesn't come from God. Pneumonia comes from pneumococcus bacteria. And then healing doesn't come from God. Healing comes from doctors who give penicillin. Okay? We no longer look to religion to be the answer to all of these kind of mysteries. There's nothing supernatural. There's nothing out there. And, God is the highest fulfillment of human aspirations, blah, 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 blah. If you're a Kaplanian, then you would say God doesn't give people cancer and God doesn't cure people from cancer. But you would also say, hang on here, this is a very important point. You would also say God never split the Red Sea. That's just a myth. God doesn't intervene in history because we don't believe in supernatural God. God never intervened in history. That's just an interpretation that ancient people used to make. The slaves went free. They made up a story. Sorry, that's a little bit trivializing it. They made up a story. They understood it. They conceptualized it as God had set them free. Okay? But there's no supernatural God who did that. Rabbi Greenberg's, by the way, I don't know that he thinks he's responding to Kaplan. He obviously read Mordechai Kaplan because all Jewish thinkers did in the 8th century. So he's surely aware of Jewish non-supernaturalist thinking, like Kaplan's thinking. And his 3-stage approach salvages traditional Jewish belief. He would say, I'm a traditional thinker. God used to intervene in history. God came down at Mount Sinai. God took Bnei Israel out of Egypt. God split the Red Sea. God set plagues to punish them when they did bad after the sin of the golden calf, et cetera, et cetera. All that stuff is true. I mean, I don't know if he thinks it's all literally true, but in his theology, it's all true, okay? Because that's what God did in stage 1. Just like the parent who scoops up their 5-year-old when they're about to run in the street and says, you can't do that, okay? So whereas Kaplan says our modern view, I retroject into all of human history. Rabbi Greenberg says, no, we don't retroject how modernity works into all of human history in the past. Human history in the past used to be different. God was more involved. All of that is, or at least could be, literally true. And then God voluntarily does tzimtzum. In the rabbinic era, God doesn't do miracles. God might comment on what the sages are arguing about in the Beit Midrash by having the wall lean or the river run backwards or a voice coming from heaven saying Rabbi Eliezer is right. People don't need to listen to that. It's given to them. And then in the third era, now, modernity, God takes even a further step back in Tzimtzum. So this is how, again, I sort of think of a lot of these theologians, they're coming up with a theology of, that allows them to sleep at night. Okay? So this theology allows you to believe God split the Red Sea and took Bnei Israel out of Egypt, and God still exists, but God chose to not intervene in the Shoah. Because God chose not to intervene in the Shoah because God doesn't intervene in modernity at all. Okay? This is important because, again, traditional Jewish theology, Haredi Judaism, sees the Shoah as a punishment unleashed by God. Just as we're in the 3 weeks, we're coming up to Tisha B'Av. The first Churban, or destruction, the destruction of the first temple, was a punishment unleashed by God. Destruction of the second temple was a punishment unleashed by God. I'd like to remind you, destruction of the first temple and second temple wasn't just a demolition of a building. Conquest of Jerusalem, thousands and thousands of people killed, exiled, taken in slavery, a city in rubble. If you read Eicha, parenthetical statement, I heard an interview with an Israeli Bible scholar who has just done 200 days of Miluim, reserve duty in the war. And he says in the interview, I used to teach my students about the Churban, the destruction, in the book of Eicha. I never actually saw a Churban until I walked through Gaza, leaving aside whatever your politics is about it. Okay? So I just want to remind you, destruction of the first temple and second temple, it's not just building demolition by the Babylonians or the Romans. Okay? It's read Eicha, right? It's starvation, deprivation, destruction of social norms and social structures, and a city being reduced to rubble. Echoes of the present. The present echoes the past. Okay. Or as one of my daughters texted me yesterday in reflecting on this, not at my suggestion, but she was practicing up a chapter of Eicha to read in her shul. She texted me and said, oh, not much has changed in a few thousand years. And I said, actually, Eicha, the Book of Lamentations, written in the 500s BCE, is some of it literary reworking of the lamentation for the destruction of Ur, which is a Sumerian lament poem written in like 2200 BCE or 2000 BCE or something like that, about the city destroyed down to rubble and people wandering the streets dazed and starving. So that's now 4,000 years ago. Human beings do the same thing to each other, but with better weapons, because we live in the third era where we have technology. This is where Rabbi Greenberg would say use of technology is a great advancement and needs to be guided by moral consciousness. By the way, he would say the same thing about, global warming, et cetera, et cetera. I want to add one more thing that he says in his book. I fear that we might not get to it. I guess we're not going to finish this week. We might go into next week. One more thing that he says in his book. He said, some people criticize all of this social action stuff, tikkun olam, the way modern liberal Jews use it, right? There are traditional Jews who kind of make fun of non-Orthodox liberal activist Jews for this tikkun olam thing. They say, you say every liberal cause is tikkun olam. You go out and you feed homeless people and you call it tikkun olam, and you work to racial equality and you call it tikkun olam, and you invented this thing that's not Jewish. You've adopted secular liberal goals and you call them Jewish and you make up this phrase tikkun olam. Rabbi Greenberg addresses that explicitly in his book. He says, no, actually, it's called Geula, redemption. He says, read Isaiah, Amos, read Jeremiah, the Jewish prophets from over 2,500 years ago. who say God wants you to clothe the naked, feed the hungry, take care of the sick. Okay? He says all this stuff, much of this stuff is commanded in the prophets. And they don't call it tikkun olam. They call it geulah, redemption, right? It's the Jewish job to help bring redemption in the world by doing these things. Contemporary liberal Jews call it tikkun olam, but it's just geulah. So don't say that it's not Jewish and that it's secular, okay? It springs from the impulse of wanting to bring geulah, but by the way, it's very hard for me to say geulah with modern Israeli pronunciation. Geulah, okay? Because that's the pronunciation of my youth. These people are working to bring geulah to the world. The people who are working to, I don't know, eradicate or limit malaria in Africa, they are enacting the human side of God's covenant with us to try to bring more geulah to the world. That's what he would say. They're doing something very Jewish. It's the covenant with the Jewish people, which expands in stage 2 to the other monotheistic religions and expands in stage 3 to contemporary geulah workers. But all of this technological advancement, et cetera, in stage 3 needs to be guided by the moral consciousness, which comes originally from God's revelation to us, or it can go awry. It can be used for ill. Just like, we're all debating about AI, right? How's it going to turn out? Is it going to help us? Is it going to kill us, right? So we invent things that can kill us. Nuclear weapons, global warming, AI, da-da-da-da. How to use all that stuff needs to be guided by an understanding of the covenant. Otherwise, you end up, again, in his 20th century thinking, with Stalinism or Hitlerism or AI, the futuristic, it could happen in 2 years. AI could decide to kill us all off as a way to solve global warming. Okay, now I'm going to pause. I think we're not going to read text this week. So I promise next week we're going to read his text on third stage, what he says about, therefore, what does prayer mean in the third stage? And I'll show you his little schematic of first stage, second stage, third stage, and then I hope we'll be done with Rabbi Greenberg next week and be able to move on to someone else. Pause for question, comment. Michael.
If Rabbi Greenberg says that we have to be guided by God's teaching and
Yes.
covenant, but also says that a person is doing God's work even if they don't know about the covenant.
Yes.
It sounds to me inconsistent, and it also sounds as though it's almost anarchy in terms of how people are to proceed, and as though there is no rabbinate anymore.
Okay.
Need for one.
Okay.
No priesthood in the Catholic religion.
Okay.
So
Pause. Okay, good. Excellent question. By the way, that's why in theory, by the way, in practice, and even though that practice has come to be criticized, that's why many of these Silicon Valley tech companies have departments that scrutinize how their products are being used. Okay? So he would say, oh, yeah, there does need to be a morality police somehow or other. Okay? So are there internal morality police saying, I'll now just jump to something topical. Are there internal morality police saying our social media algorithms are giving teenage girls more videos, I'm not going to say any company, more videos about how to be skinny, and so it is actually increasing the problem of eating disorders, and so we need to change that algorithm because that's wrong? Or is the company guided by, we are ignoring that information and profit is more important? So we've seen those, by the way, AI also, right? We see all of those debates playing out in front of us every day in the newspaper. Are these advances going to be guided by a sense of what is right, fair, and just in terms of, by the way, what he would say, what defines what is right, fair, and just? People looking to, you could call it philosophy. If you want to be modern, you could call it philosophy, which is the heir of wisdom traditions, which is the heir of religions, who say there's certain things that are right and wrong, right? So is a sense of right, and again, right is what is right. Right are things, again, back to him, things that enhance human freedom, equality, life, creativity. I think I might have forgotten dignity is in there also. Things that enhance those things. He would say, yeah, there need to be thinkers who are minding the store. Otherwise, scientists can say, by the way, what's the early version of this from 100 years ago? Germ warfare, right? Germ warfare. We can develop science to kill our enemies with mustard gas. Mustard gas from, what am I talking about, 110 years ago, okay? Germ warfare, algorithms that give anxious, self-doubting teenage girls more videos about how to lose weight by skipping meals. So, you can make the whole list, if you want, of technology that is not guided by morality. Now, he doesn't say every scientist also needs to be a philosopher, but he says, oh, yes, part of the enterprise of human advancement needs to be guided by a moral sense. I don't know what he would say about, was it right or wrong to drop the bomb on Hiroshima, to end the war quicker, to save more lives. I mean, I don't know his opinion about that, so I don't want to speak for him. But let's just say, okay, that's the kind of debate where there is moral debate. Something can be done technologically. Does that mean it's good for it to be done? And that's what guides that decision. Whether it's mustard gas, whether it's a nuclear bomb, whether it's social media algorithm, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I don't think I need to make the list for you again, just like open the paper every day, right? But you could open the paper, I'm talking about mustard gas, so I'm going back to, the 19 teens, right? Open the paper. So we have at least, I don't know about the 1800s, but we have at least, I don't know, was there debate in the 1800s about we're having factories and that's making cotton better and more efficiently and cheaper for people, therefore, but it ends up destroying the villages and the heartland and traditional culture. Therefore, factories are a bad thing. I don't know. There probably was. There was a debate like that in the 1800s, right? The Luddites smashed the machines, right? But cotton, it was great. It was great. It made things cheap. It made clothing cheap. It was based on slavery, and at a certain point, there was a moral debate about it. And a decision was made that which we thought was morally acceptable is actually morally wrong. Okay. So, sorry, long-winded answer, Michael. He would say within society, there need to be moral voices guiding the technological choices. I just made a T-shirt slogan. Moral voices guiding technological choices. Go ahead.
So is this now the role of the rabbis? Is that what he would say?
We'd have to go back and look at who guides the moral thinking. I think he would probably say rabbis, priests, ministers. I think he'd also say thinkers. I don't know. I don't exactly know the answer to that. I know some people who have sat at his feet. I might ask them the question. But he would say ultimately it comes from wisdom traditions, which comes from religion, which have canons of ideas about what's right and wrong. Okay. By the way, you have this debate now. You're reading about it in, Christianity, evangelical Christianism in America, which in recent decades has gotten yoked to, I'm going to put it in air quotes, right-wing agendas. And there's now internal debate in evangelical Christianity about wait, what would Jesus do? Didn't Jesus say, take care of those, the haves have to take care of the have-nots? And we need to embrace, Jesus said we embrace the criminals, the prostitutes, the people everyone hated, the prostitutes and the tax collectors, the sinners, okay? I mean, prostitutes and tax collectors in New Testament times, right? The people who everyone hated, who people thought were the lowest of the low, right? Jesus said, no, God embraces the lowest of the low. Suffer all the little children to come unto me. Suffer means allow. Again, so there's a debate going on now today within American evangelical Christianity. What is the moral guidance on our social and political positions? What should the moral guidance be? right? And again, by the way, we have stuff that we've read about these Silicon Valley companies do have internal, I don't know what they call the Department of Moral Advice, right? But they have an internal Department of Moral Advice. And sometimes the CEO says, we don't care what it says because we don't care what they say because this algorithm is more profitable. Okay. And then they're called in front of a congressional hearing, right? Or there's a whistleblower who writes a book saying, they knew what the moral calculus was and they ignored it. Because again, in the third stage, God gives human beings the right, I don't want to say the right, sorry, the ability, the wherewithal to ignore morality. I'll sort of just leave that. Other question, comment? Diane, hand. Diane, and then Bob behind you. Yep, go ahead.
So I must admit to having great difficulty with this theology.
Oh, good.
Because it feels like someone who grew up Orthodox, which I believe he did.
He is Orthodox. He did, and he would say, I am Orthodox. And he would say, wait, I am Orthodox, and I am also a modern human being. Go ahead, Diane.
Right. So what I sense is he's trying to reconcile the modern piece that he gets with the ancient piece that he doesn't really get. So he ascribes it to like these three stages. The notion of a God who decides now I'm going to intervene and now I'm not going to intervene and choosing just feels it. So I'm reminded of what I think was a Twilight Zone episode where there was a person staring into a microscope and he was looking at a world.
Yeah.
And basically it was a question of scale, right? The human beings in this world were tiny and he was giant.
Yes.
And that's kind of how this feels.
Okay. So I want to respond on his behalf.
Okay.
He would say, oh, you are unhappy with my theory because I am trying to explain things that seem inconsistent. So I just want to respond now as Avi. Well, there are two alternative ways of being consistent. One is the Kaplan way, which is to say God never split the Red Sea. That's having the modern view retrojected. And the other way is the Haredi way, which is to say the Shoah was a punishment because Eastern European Jewry started becoming too secular. So God sent a punishment. It's no different than God allowed the first temple to be destroyed because of idolatry. They'd say, what's the difference? Theologically, exactly the same thing. Okay, so yes, and Rabbi Greenberg would say, I reject Kaplan consistency number one, and I reject Haredi consistency number two. And I get that you may choose yourself as a Jewish thinker to not opt for his solution, okay? But I want us to understand why he opts for his solution. He opts for his solution because alternative number one and alternative number two are both unacceptable. It's unacceptable to him to say God never did anything, intervening in human history, and it's unacceptable to him to say God decided to let 1.5 million children die in the Shoah as a punishment because Eastern European Jewry was becoming more secular. I reject both of these positions. By the way, Martin Luther, founder of the Reformation, anti-Semite, but that's how people were back then, right? He said, I think, it's one of these quotes, I don't know, who knows if he said it or if it's attributed to him, here I stand, I can do no other. That's what Yitzhak Greenberg would say. He would say, I'm sorry, Diane, I'm not giving up on the Red Sea and Yetziat Mitzrayim and Matan Torah Misinai, and I'm not giving up on, and I'm not going to blame God for the Shoah. Here I stand, I can do no other. This is my way of, instead of just saying inconsistent, by the way, inconsistent, it's not inconsistent. Inconsistent means, well, sometimes this and sometimes that. It's not inconsistent. It's a plan. The plan is just as you raise your child and you step back at various stages to let them take more charge. God chooses tzimtzum again. He says, I'm just using a traditional Jewish concept. It's from Kabbalah. I didn't make it up. Here you would say, God is choosing tzimtzum at various stages to step back and allow more role and control for human activity. Okay. And I don't mind that you don't like it. Yeah. By the way, I don't teach you any of these things because you have to like it. I just want you to be aware of it. Okay. There's one more question behind Michael. We're about out of time, a minute. So go ahead.
I just
Yeah.
can you state the covenant? That's the basis.
Okay. The covenant is God says to the Jewish people at the beginning. I'm going to go to the beginning of the covenant. Covenant means agreement. God says, I'm going to be your God and you're going to be my people. I'm going to be your God means I'm going to do certain things for you. You're special, blah, blah, blah. You're going to be my people means you are going to fulfill my will. Here is my will. I want you to be an exemplar nation in enlarging the realm of human dignity, life, freedom, equality, and creativity, because I, God, am ultimate freedom, life, dignity, equality, and creativity. I am the ultimate of that, and I want you people on earth to try to enact that on earth. Therefore, I have given you this thing called the Torah, which has 613 specific mitzvot, and that's what I want you to do, to try to do your side of the covenant. So on the one hand, it's very, you asked a great question. On the one hand, it's very simple Jewish concrete, traditional. Do the mitzvahs that I've given you. But the theoretical part of it, his understanding of the covenant, is God is saying, I am giving you these instructions because I want you to enlarge the realm of human life. I forgot holiness. I keep changing the 5. Life, holiness, creativity, freedom, equality, and dignity, because I, God, am ultimate life, creativity, dignity, holiness, and life, right? And this is now very familiar. Afata, ani, afhu chanun v'rachum, afata hayeh rachum v'chanun. Just as God is merciful and compassionate, you be merciful and compassionate. Just as God took care of the dead, you take care of the dead. Just as God visits the sick, you visit the sick. Okay? So I've given you a whole set of rules which have behind them an ideology or philosophy, the purpose of which is to enlarge the realm of human blah, 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 all those words that I said, and that's your part of the covenant. Now, today the covenant is, I hang back and watch. I care. It's not that I don't care, okay? But I'm letting you do everything. That's your job now. It's not my job anymore. You're the grown-up. Human race, you're the grown-ups now. If you want to make a giant famine from Stalinism where millions of people die, that's your choice that you made. You failed in keeping the covenant. I'll use a faraway example so that I don't, the Ukrainian starvation of them. Okay. It's a safe, faraway example. So no one will accuse me of politics. Okay. Be Torah, enact God's covenant. God willing, we'll all meet again together next week. Thank you.
Thank you, Avi.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.